I'm going to present you Dr. Evelyn Falconi-Klein. Hello Evelyn, I'm Raffaele Gianotti, a dermatopathologist from the University of Milan.
Guten Tag an alle Kollegen in Deutschland. Ich bin Evelyn Falconi-Klein, Hautärztin in Mailand seit 25 Jahren. Guten Tag. Heute sprechen wir über unsere Erfahrungen hier in Mailand, die wir mit hautassoziierten Covid-Infektionen gehabt haben. Die ganze Geschichte mit Covid fing bei uns hier in Mailand an Ende Februar. In Italien haben wir seit Anfang der Epidemie ca. 1,5 Millionen Covid-Patienten gehabt. Heutzutage, die Daten sind von November diesen Jahres, haben wir ca. 790.000 Covid-positive Fälle, die sich in verschiedenen Stadien der systemischen Erkrankung befinden. Sowohl Patienten, die zu Hause behandelt werden, als auch Patienten, die intubiert sind. Amerikanische Arbeiten suggerieren, dass ca. 20% aller dieser Patienten Dermatosen haben. Unsere persönliche Meinung suggeriert eher 10% der Patienten. Aber wenn wir auch davon ausgehen, dass sogar noch weniger Patienten Hauterscheinungen hätten, das heißt zum Beispiel 5%, würde es bedeuten, dass wir ca. 39.500 Patienten mit Covid haben, die Dermatosen aufweisen. Es sieht so aus, British Medical Journal hat es aufgezeigt, dass 4/5 aller Fälle asymptomatisch sind. Und das ist sehr wichtig, weil das bedeutet, dass wir hier in Italien, wenn wir das hochrechnen, circa 3 Millionen Patienten hätten, die völlig asymptomatische Träger sind. Und wenn wir dann davon ausgehen, dass circa 5% oder weniger dieser Patienten Dermatosen haben, wären das immerhin 158.000 Patienten mit Hauterscheinungen. Und ist das möglich? Ja. Wie sieht die Covid-Situation in der Welt aus? Die Weltsituation sieht momentan so aus, dass ca. über 60 Millionen Covid-Erkrankte in der Welt sind und mit über 1,4 Millionen Toten. Warum gibt es aber so wenige Arbeiten? Also es gibt ca. 852 Arbeiten über Dermatosen bei Covid-Infektionen. Das ist relativ wenig bei dieser hohen Zahl von Erkrankungen. Das liegt daran, dass die Dermatologen nur bei PCR-positiven Patienten, die also nachgewiesen Covid haben oder auch stationär aufgenommen sind, dass sie dann Arbeiten schreiben. Alle anderen Patienten, die asymptomatisch sind oder so in der Praxis mit eigenartigen Hauterscheinungen auftreten, werden gar nicht in Betracht gezogen. Alles ist im Februar angefangen. Sie sehen hier unseren dermatologischen Kollegen Valerio Marzano aus der Uniklinik Milan. Er war der erste Covid-Patient in Mailand und das war am 23. Februar. Professor Gianotti hat ihn angerufen und Professor Marzano war stationär aufgenommen im größten Krankenhaus für infektiöse Erkrankungen hier in Mailand.
So, after speaking with Angelo Marzano, I go back through my files, searching from cases resembling viral disease with a cutaneous rash, and I found this case of a 18-year-old boy in the first days of January, and I show you the histopathological specimen. Here you can observe nothing more than some nests of Langerhans cells here and here, and in superficial and perivascular lymphocytic infiltration. So I think that everybody knows that Langerhans cells are the first patrolling unit line that activated when some antigens arrive into the skin, a viral antigen, bacterial antigen, or drug antigen. I have no other clues about this case, suspecting a SARS-CoV-2 infection, but I must tell you that 1 month ago we tested PCR for SARS-CoV-2 on the paraffin section, and we found positivity with PCR, and so this is a case of January in Milan, infected by COVID-19 with no other systemic symptoms except from the skin, the rash skin. But what's happened at the end of February, in the initial and dramatic phases of COVID-19 emergency in northern Italy, the intensive care units were at the verge of the collapse, and infectious disease specialists and anesthesiologists had no time to deal with cutaneous manifestation caused by this disease. And one day, I remember, the phone in my office rang, and one guy told me, "Hey, can you come into emergency intensive care unit, because we have an intubated woman with the red legs." And you can see here the picture. So one of our surgeons went there, and he was able to get 2 punch biopsies. And what I'm showing you is the real first published histopathology picture of an skin of an infected patient. And here you can see this little thrombus and other 2 small thrombi in the mid-dermis here. And then look at this area, nest of Langerhans cells. So we collected 3 patients with different stage of disease, systemic disease and cutaneous manifestation, and we wrote a paper that was published in April on Acta Dermatovenerologica. But what's happened in March and April 20, most probably COVID-19 infected patient, we began to visit a lot of people with suspected COVID-19 infection, and most of them were very young patients, from age 8 up to 30 years old, and they showed urticarial and erythema multiforme like lesions, chilblain lesions, and very rarely the PCR swab was positive. Only the ugly duck was positive. Most of the people were negative, or we couldn't try to perform PCR swab because at that time was not possible to perform so many PCR swab in that period. That was really a big mess in Milan. And Dr. Sebastiano Recalcati, my brilliant ex-resident, wrote the first world skin and COVID-19 paper about it. Now I show you some picture of the clinical presentation at the time. So have a look at this kind of lesion. This is an old woman with a lividoid appearance of the foot. This is a young boy with an erythema multiforme like lesion on the palm. It looks like urticarial reaction. This is a man with a chilblain lesion and a young girl with a urticarial reaction pattern. Curiously, the elbow is one of the most frequent sites in which this kind of reaction appears. And this man has a double appearance, a double feature. At first glance it looks like an erythema multiforme, but with some urticarial feature. And look at the elbow of this man with the urticarial appearance, and I show you the histopathology of this man, and here you can find this elongated dermal duct with many lymphocytes around the duct, and down in the deep dermis. Here, have a look to this multiple small thrombi, and in the upper part of the epidermis, a band-like infiltration with the exocytosis, many lymphocytes, mostly CD4 and CD8, but look at this acrosyringium, is totally involved by the infiltration, and going along the skin specimen we can find some necrotic keratinocytes. In brief, it looks like an erythema multiforme-like reaction, particularly involving the eccrine ducts and acrosyringeal structure. And this picture coming from Dr. Sebastiano Recalcati, I put this icon because in the past we saw this kind of lesion, chilblain lesion, and in time not related with the COVID-19 infection. And at the first glance you cannot differentiate a chilblain lesion of a COVID-19 patient from a classical chilblain due to the cryoimmunoglobulin. And this is a young boy with this urticarial reaction going towards a classical erythema multiforme. And this is an advanced stage, and look at the elbow, and look at this papule, coalition in a large urticarial plaque, the finger with this hemorrhagic papules, and this necrotic area. But what about chilblains? The funniest scientific observation ever published about chilblains coming from Belgium. And Belgian scientists, frustrated by PCR swab and serological negativity, they concluded their paper that during lockdown most of the patients were reported using recreational drugs, herbal medicine, and energy drinks, and finally most of the patients declared that they remain barefoot in socks most of the day. But please note, this is a systemic COVID-19 patient. I don't think this guy was used walking upside down at home. And many in Italy, many young patients with chilblains in very hot climates like in Sicily, they have chilblains, and so no cryoglobulins can explain why we had in Italy this pandemic of chilblains in south of Italy. Obviously, the chilblains epidemic worldwide is related to SARS-CoV-2 infection. Simply, we currently know very few about the immunological mechanism of the host response, but please keep calm, and clinical lesion picture be back soon, because I am a dermatopathologist and I want to show you what happened in May in Milan. I saw many patients highly suspicious for COVID-19 dermatosis in high-risk asymptomatic carriers, because mostly of these patients were locked down with parents positive, or they met friends with a positive infection, and then they developed dermatosis with no clinical systemic symptom of COVID-19 infection. And I show you the histopathological picture, this slide. This is what I call mini pernio pattern, because you see a very dense lymphocytic infiltration along the vessels in the upper part, in middle part of the dermis, and in the deep part of the dermis, particularly around eccrine glands. And look at this dermal duct going through the acrosyringium, is totally effaced by lymphocytes. So it looks like a pernio, and we call mini pernio feature. Then another mini pernio. Look at this dermal duct, totally effaced by lymphocytes, also in deep part of the dermis. Look at these glands, and in the upper part of the dermis, a superficial and perivascular lymphocytic infiltration with many extravasated red blood cells. And also we call this kind of pattern mini pernio. And the third pattern or feature I noticed in the histopathology of this kind of high-risk patient is very close to erythema multiforme. Look, this band-like infiltration with lots of lymphocytes, with exocytosis, satellitosis, and necrotic keratinocytes in the epidermis. Look at these swollen vessels with this funny bubble appearance of the serum, but have a look to this dermal duct and this huge acrosyringeal duct. And different from the classical erythema multiforme, in this punch you can see also lymphocytes around the glomerular gland in the medium dermis. So our study had been performed using the ancient method, clinical and histopathological observation, and we wrote some articles, and we get the cover of the American Journal of Dermatopathology and the Journal of Dermatological Science, writing papers about the high-risk asymptomatic, systemic asymptomatic patient with particular atypical dermatosis, is with a very strange histopathological feature when the dermatosis is resolved. So we lost the last piece of the puzzle, and it's very difficult to manage this patient. But luckily we have the monoclonal antibody now on the tissue, on the paraffin section, and we studied a lot of patients, and we published a paper on Acta Dermatovenerologica. In this study we compare 10 biopsies of dermatosis in COVID-19 systemic infected patients versus 20 biopsies of clinical and histological atypical dermatosis in high-risk asymptomatic patients, PCR swab negative or not performed. When I mean high risk, I mean people who was locked down with parents, relatives, or friends positive for COVID infection. And we found 4 histopathological patterns, and no differences between the 2 groups were observed in these patterns. And more than 70% of high-risk group had immunohistochemistry positivity on the tissue. And look at this slide, you can see the positivity of the monoclonal antibody in the eccrine glands, here and here, here, and in the acrosyringeal ducts, here and here. It's a perfect cuticular staining. But why we found the immunohistochemistry positivity in eccrine gland in the skin? We don't know exactly, but I can tell you that in 2004, on the Journal of Pathology, Hamming published an article in which he found that the ACE2 protein, the functional receptor for SARS coronavirus infection, he was speaking about the severe acute respiratory syndrome, is particularly expressed on the eccrine gland, and so this can explain that the eccrine gland is the ingoing pathway for SARS-CoV-2 virus, or the outgoing pathway of this virus, coming probably from the blood into the eccrine gland and then going to be excreted from the skin through the glands and through the acrosyringeum. But there is no absolute certain proof about it. Anyway, here I show you the histological pattern, the 4 histological pattern we describe. The chilblain pattern is very absolutely similar to that observed before the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2, and there is a heavy perivascular and periadnexal infiltration along the eccrine gland, and when the infiltration is very dense, there is a detachment of the junction. And you cannot differentiate, looking at the slide, the chilblain pattern of a COVID-19 patient from the chilblain pattern of a patient with no infection but with cryoglobulin. That is different when we look at the slide of mini chilblain patterns, because you can see here the dermal duct involvement in the upper part of the dermis, perivascular infiltration with the extravased red blood cells, and look at also the glands in the mid-dermis and a heavy periglandular infiltration. And this punch biopsy comes from a patient with no systemic symptoms, but with the dermatosis and high risk of infection because he was locked at home with the parents with COVID-19 severe infection. Then we found another pattern in this kind of patient, asymptomatic systemic patient, and as I showed you before, it looks like an erythema multiforme, but that particularly involves the acrosyringeum. Then elevated vasculitis pattern with a perivascular cuff or lymphocytes, thrombosis in the deeper part of the dermis, vascular endothelial hyperplasia, many multiple minute thrombi in the deep dermis, or medium-sized thrombi in the middle dermis, or in the upper part of the dermis. Actum, because we have defined precise clinical pattern in the asymptomatic COVID-19 positive patient with dermatosis. However, the clinical diagnosis is extremely difficult because it mimics well-known dermatosis occasionally related in the past to a different viral disease, and so only well-trained dermatopathologist or pathologist can help you and confirm the suspicion of dermatosis associated with the SARS-CoV-2 infection. And Cristina Galvan-Cadas, a dermatologist from Madrid, she wrote a beautiful paper on British Journal of Dermatology with many clinical pictures and with a brilliant classification of the cutaneous manifestation of COVID-19 patients. And in the appendix of the paper, there is a huge PDF with hundreds of pictures. You can download it or from the website of the British Journal of Dermatology. Otherwise, if you are not able to download, please send me a mail and I will be very happy to send you the PDF. Your aim is to find healthy carriers of COVID-19 infection with dermatosis, because nobody cares if a COVID-19 positive patient in hospital has a dermatosis. We, dermatologists and dermatopathologists, are the only men in the front line, like ancient Roman, who can successfully complete this difficult mission. So if you want to know more about the primary role of the dermatologist in the battle to coronavirus infections, please go on Google and search SARS-CoV-2 and skin, a hidden treasure, and you will be able to read this editorial in which is explained how a dermatologist can help people searching for dermatosis in COVID-19 patient with no systemic symptoms except from dermatosis. So this is COVID-19 symptomatic patient with chilblains. This is asymptomatic patient, but PCR was positive on the tissue, and we found the gene sequences of the COVID-19, and immunohistochemistry was positive. This is the same for in this woman, and this the same in this man, and all of these 3 patients had no systemic symptoms except from dermatosis. And look this urticaria clinical feature. This woman was asymptomatic, but she had a sudden urticarial eruption. The same this man, the same this young girl, and we found PCR positivity in the tissue, paraffin embedded tissue, and with the immunohistochemistry on the skin biopsy. And look this giant urticarial of this woman. These papules, urticarial papules, on the thigh, and on the elbow of this young girl. Have a look to the skin specimen. This comes from the giant urticarial woman. Look, it's not the skin biopsy of an urticarial reaction pattern, because here you can see vesicles in the epidermis, here and here, but look at these vessels. There is a dense perivascular lymphocytic cuff with this funny aspect, bubbling aspect of the serum. Look, the dermal duct involvement, and these verticalized vessels. That is very common in this patient, in the skin biopsy of this patient. And this vesicle here and here does not match absolutely with the biopsy of a classical urticarial. It looks like more photo-induced or photoallergical reaction. Okay, this is another slide in which you can see this massive perivascular infiltration of lymphocytes, the initial formation of thrombi, and this large vessel verticalized running into the dermis very close to dermal duct. And here this curious bubbling aspect of the serum, and this patient was confirmed to have a COVID-19 infection using immunohistochemistry and using PCR search. Okay, let's have a look to erythema multiforme clinical feature. All the patients you see here are systemic asymptomatic. They have no fever, they have no cough, but they have only skin lesion. And in this skin lesion we found the PCR positivity, immunohistochemistry positivity, and they have a peculiar histopathological feature. And I want to underline that these lesions are absolutely identical to the erythema multiforme, not related with COVID-19 infection. And this is the histopathological slide, and you can see that in the upper part of the epidermis it looks like a real erythema multiforme with a band-like lymphocytic infiltration, with heavy exocytosis, necrotic keratinocytes, satellitosis. Oh, have a look at these enlarged vessels, but in the deeper part of the dermis see these verticalized vessels, and above all, in close to the hypodermis, you see this gland with lymphocytic infiltration, and the lymphocytic infiltration in the glands it never happens in a classical erythema multiforme, not related to COVID-19 infection. This is the livedo vasculitis feature in patient systemic asymptomatic, and the PCR swab was negative in this teenager. And look at the lesion, it's a livedo vasculitis. Look at this woman, she was asymptomatic systemic, and PCR swab was negative. And this is the first famous patient intubated in the intensive care unit. in which I show you the histopathological picture with thrombi at the beginning of this presentation. You cannot differentiate from the clinical aspect livedovasculitis in a patient affected by COVID-19 infection or in a patient with asymptomatic who is asymptomatic carriers from a patient with a livedovasculitis due to other pathogenic mechanism not related to the COVID-19 infection. Well, this is a very suspicious case because it's a mix of lesions, papulomacular and eroded crusted lesion. The patient was systemic asymptomatic. The immunohistochemistry on the skin specimen was positive, and have a look to the slide. This is a mix, is a superficial and deep perivascular infiltration with band-like feature with exocytosis, some necrotic keratinocytes, and look at the vessels. There is a massive lymphocytic infiltration along the vessels and along the dermal duct and the eccrine gland. This is a 33 years old man. The PCR swab was positive at March, then negativity in April, and later a maculo-purpuric eruption on the leg. It looked like a pigmented purpuric dermatitis. It's a chameleon because you cannot differentiate. If you see a patient in your office with this kind of lesion, you don't think, oh, it's an asymptomatic carrier of COVID-19, or this guy had a COVID-19 infection 2 months or 3 months ago. It looked like a purpuric pigmented dermatitis, and the histopathology show this huge infiltration around the vessels with extravasated lymphocytes and the early formation of thrombi here. Oh, this is a young boy. The father is COVID-19 affected, and 1 week ago he went to our department and he showed us this erythematopurpuric lesion with livedoid areas, and histologically there was a leukocytoclastic vasculitis, and the PCR swab was negative for this young patient. We will wait next month. I'm sure he will develop IgG and IgM antibody in the serum. This is a systemic asymptomatic patient, and the PCR swab was positive. Same business. It looks like an eczematid like purpura, and the histopathology was identical to the case I previously showed you. This is interesting because at the beginning of the first pandemic in February and in March, we saw this patient with the PCR positivity. This patient was in quarantine at home with PCR swab positivity. This patient was recovered with slight symptoms in the hospital, This man had a PCR swab positivity, and we found PCR also in the skin biopsy. And this is an asymptomatic patient with histopathology and immunohistochemistry positivity for the SARS-CoV-2 infection, and all these patient looks like Grover disease histologically, but some people claims it looks like chickenpox. If you look at the slide I show you here, it's a superficial perivascular dermatitis with this acantholytic cleft and with this peculiar carotenoid site enlarged with huge nucleus that is classical for Grover disease. There is a heavy infiltration with extravasated red blood cells, and look at this vesicle with this large keratinocyte resembling those infected by herpes virus, and down these huge vessels filled with red blood cells. So this is a Grover-like disease in a patient infected by COVID-19. And also in this case, it is the punch biopsy of the patient with the PCR swab positivity, and look at these vessels. There is an early phase of thrombi, these large vessels, eosinophils, and the classical aspect of Grover disease. So we don't know exactly which is the relationship between Grover disease and COVID-19 infection. I can tell you that in the past Grover disease has been associated to other viral infection such as HIV or varicella zoster virus. Anyway, when you see this kind of clinical feature looking chickenpox, just think to a patient with an asymptomatic systemic COVID-19 infection, and you can be sure that if you get a punch, the result will be a Grover-like disease. This was also confirmed by some colleagues coming from Spain. Grover-like skin eruption and other cutaneous manifestation in COVID-19 patient, and COVID-19 and alopecia. Most of the patients after the infection have a telogen effluvium, but the virus can induce also a scoring alopecia. You can see this patient, and large thrombi in the upper part of the dermis with the necrotic epithelium and with the scarring alopecia. And here you can see the immunohistochemistry positivity for SARS-CoV-2 in the eccrine gland. What's new? We did PCR, as I told you, on paraffin section, and we tested 20 biopsies of clinical and histological atypical dermatosis in high-risk asymptomatic patient with PCR swab negative or not performed, and only 8 cases were positive for PCR on paraffin sections, just because this technique is very difficult on the skin. We don't know exactly because, but probably because the viral load is probably too low in cutaneous lesion, that is cutaneous punch is different from a lung. Anyway, these 8 cases were asymptomatic, and we found with PCR the positivity in the tissue in paraffin section. Only skin lesion. This patient had a lesion very close to erythema multiforme. This looks like more vasculitis with some feature of erythema multiforme. Urticarial lesion. This is the man I showed at the beginning of the presentation, and Schieblein. Obviously, we tested PCR in the first patient we saw in February, and she was positive for PCR on paraffin section.
Was gibt's Neues? Wir haben an der Uni-Hautklinik Mailand in der Kinderabteilung von Ferdinando Gianotti 8 Kinder gesehen, die eine Covid-19-assoziierte papillopurpurische hämorrhagische Dermatitis aufgewiesen haben, die unserer Meinung nach eine neue Hauterkrankung darstellt, und haben sie PPH-19 Dermatitis of Childhood genannt.
Pityriasi lichenode acuta è varioliforme, Mucha-Habermann disease. Some Italian friends and my friend Kutzner in the past, he described some cases and they found the evidences of human parvovirus B19. Some people in the past thought this disease could be related with a viral infection. We saw 8 patients in our pediatric department of the Clinicopathological in Milan, and this is a collage of the patient. We perform also dermoscopy, the histopathology. The mini pernio feature was evident in these kids. The immunohistochemistry was positive. There was the destruction of the dermal duct with the destruction of the acrosyringium, and also in this case the dermal ducts were involved, and the blood vessels of the dermis were verticalized. There were extravased red blood cells, and in one case we found a diffuse thrombosis of the dermis, upper part of the dermis, and immunohistochemistry was always positive. This is the first patient. The clinical diagnosis was Mucha-Habermann disease. The PCR swab in this kid was negative, and the immunohistochemistry on the paraffin section was positive, and he had the mini pernio histological feature. In this case we perform also dermoscopy, in which you can see hemorrhagic areas and the diffuse papules that resemble really the Mucha-Habermann disease, but the histopathology was completely different because there was an involvement on the dermal duct and the large vessel verticalizing running together with dermal duct, and in the upper part of the dermis extravased red blood cells and a band-like infiltration with some necrotic keratinocyte. But the corneum was totally different from the corneum that is seen in Mucha-Habermann. This is the prototype of this new disease we described, because the lesions were papillohemorrhagic and sometimes necrotic here, involving the legs and the trunk. And here I show you the incredible diffusion of thrombi in the upper part of the dermis here, with necrotic epidermis and massive exocytosis of lymphocyte CD4 and CD8, involvement of blood vessels, and as usually involvement of the deep gland in the deep part of the dermis. Also, in this case, immunohistochemistry on the tissue was positive. This is a new case coming from Dr. Cutrone from Vicenza. Is 9 years old boy. The clinical diagnosis was Mucha-Habermann. He had this disease for 1 month. Here you can see the trunk and the feet, and with the clinical aspect of papulohemorrhagic lesions. And look, this slide is not that one can expect in a Mucha-Habermann, but it's the superficial and deep perivascular infiltration with a heavy cuff of lymphocytes and red blood vessels, and look, the same business, the dermal duct involvement. So histologically is totally different from Mucha-Habermann disease. Another case, very recent, with this papulohemorrhagic lesion on the trunk and the legs, and the patient is 11 years old boy, Mucha-Habermann for 2 months. The PCR was negative, PCR swab was negative, and this is another beautiful example of what I call mini pernio, with the involvement of the equine duct and extravasated red blood cells in the upper part of the dermis, but nothing similar to the Mucha-Habermann disease histopathologically. Look at this case. The dermatosis lasted 4 months. The PCR swab was negative. Here you can see the hypopigmented area after the resolution of the disease. Just only one papule remaining, and the histopathology showed the involvement of the acrosyringium here and the dermal duct with a heavy perivascular and band-like infiltration with necrotic keratinocytes. But does PNH 19 affect adult also? Yes, we saw this 37 years old man with Mucha-Habermann disease for 5 months and IgG serological positivity for SARS-CoV-2 after 5 months of disease, and the clinical lesions are very close to those we observed in young boy with papulonecrotic lesion. Here a scar remaining. But is the children's story over? No, it's not over. Look at this 2 years old girl with this urticarioid lesion on the leg. PCR swab and serological test negative at the time of biopsy. We perform histopathology and immunohistochemistry. Immunohistochemistry was positive. Then I show you the slide, same business, the destruction of acrosyringeal, a superficial and deep perivascular band-like infiltration, particularly involving the acrosyringeal ducts and the deep part of the gland in the deep dermis, with a very heavy infiltration around eccrine glands. And 3 months after resolution of the dermatosis, serological IgM and IgG positivity, and this little patient had no systemic symptoms, with no fever and cough, and she had no contact with patient positive or relatives, parents positive. But this is funny because it's a Cameron suite is a urticarial lesion of this kid. Is a little friend of the previous patient, and this boy came in our department a couple of days ago, and we saw the histopathology that looks like absolutely similar to those observed in the other little patient, and they were used to play together at home. Involvement of the dermal duct, heavy infiltration, and superficial and deep perivascular pattern with involvement of the deep glands. And we are waiting for a serological IgM and IgG positivity in the next month. Oh, the Italian patient 0, I think that Dr. Falconi-Klein can better explain you in German what we observed.
Was gibt's Neues? Der italienische Patient 0, der erste italienische Patient. Wir haben einen Artikel geschrieben über wer ist der erste Patient 0 in Italien. Und zwar haben wir versucht zu finden, wer ist der erste Patient 0 in Italien. Wir haben einen Artikel geschrieben über Covid-assoziierte Dermatosen, die vor dem Beginn der Epidemie aufgetreten sind. Professor Raffaele Gianotti hat versucht, in seinem Archiv Histologien zu suchen, die mit diesen Covid-assoziierten Histologien, die wir während der Pandemie gefunden haben, übereinstimmen, und hat eine Patientin 0 gefunden. Diese erste Patientin hat typische histopathologische Hauterscheinungen für Covid aufgezeigt in der Histopathologie, und diese Hauterscheinungen sind bestätigt worden in der Immunhistopathologie und in der FISH-Reaktion. Dieses 8-jährige Mädchen hatte Urtikaria-ähnliche Hauterscheinungen aufgezeigt. Dieses ist auch bestätigt worden danach. Es wurde auch ein Artikel geschrieben über die Abwässer in Norditalien. Man hat in den Abwässern schon SARS-CoV gefunden, und zwar im Ende von 2019. Im Tumor Journal wurde auch festgestellt, hier am Istituto Nazionale dei Tumori, dass in einer Studie, die im September 2019 durchgeführt worden ist, asymptomatische Personen, die an einer Tumorstudie teilgenommen haben, wurden 111 Personen von 959 Personen gefunden. Das war 11% aller Individuen, die eben SARS-CoV-positive Antikörper hatten. Außerdem gab es noch einen anderen Artikel, der sehr interessant war und zwar immer in der Universität Mailand durchgeführt. Ein Kind hat einen Abstrich gemacht im Anfang Dezember 2019, bevor alles anfing, und hatte ein Kawasaki Disease-like Inflammatory Syndrome. Das sah Masern ähnlich aus. Ein Abstrich wurde damals durchgeführt. Man hat dann später festgestellt, dass dieser Abstrich SARS-CoV-positiv war.
What's new? We performed Rna-FISH on selected patient, detection of SARS-CoV-2 using RNA fluorescent in situ hybridization and immunohistochemistry in biopsy of dermatosis of patient without systemic evidence of COVID-19 infection. And this is the first case I show you earlier, and all these other cases have only dermatosis with no systemic symptoms. PCR swab was negative or not performed, and the histopathology is the classical, as I showed in the previous slide, and Rna-FISH was evident in the epine gland. So we found with this technique gene sequences of the SARS-CoV-2, and we confirm in all the cases, all the 7 cases, the immunohistochemistry positivity in the glands and in the acrosyringeal ducts. Here I want to show you the mimicking simulator ability of this terrible virus. This is 55-year-old woman with COVID-19 infection. She was treated at home in quarantine with this drug, and 10 days after pharyngeal swabs negativity, a sudden onset of pustular dermatosis. Here you can see pustular dermatosis, thousands of pustules on the sternum, on the arm. Looking on PubMed, we found that in 2011, a case of celecoxib-induced acute generalized xanthomatosis pustulosis, obviously previously the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2, but here there is another paper, acute generalized xanthomatosis pustulosis after COVID-19 infection, a case report from Saudi Arabia. It must be clear that the dermatologist must be aware and able to differentiate from a COVID-19 dermatosis from dermatosis due to the drug treatment that can mimic a COVID-19 active infection. And look at this 48-year-old woman, maculopapular eruption for 2 months. On a site, a corymbiform feature. Have a look to the slide. At first glance, look at this deep glandular infiltration, periglandular infiltration, and heavy perivascular infiltration. But if you go closer, you look that most of the cells are plasma cells here and here and here. So this is a pitfall, because one can suspect a COVID-19 related dermatosis. To the contrary, the patient has a secondary syphilis that has been proved also with the serological test, and this clinical feature is a corymbiform that is very, very, very rare. So SARS-CoV-2 is a chameleon. SARS-CoV-2 is a very tough opponent. It mimics the common dermatosis, but he'll cheat you when you think it's right in front of your ocular. It is not there. So don't forget that all the thousands of authentic dermatoses described in the sacred dermatological texts still exist. This will be our next step challenge. Don't mix classical dermatosis with COVID-19 dermatosis in asymptomatic carrier. Would you believe this is the first German asymptomatic carrier with the coronavirus and dermatosis? On the left you can see the picture of dermatosis coming from Spanish confirmed patient. Cristina Galvan Casas did a beautiful atlas in which you can find really hundreds of pictures. And look at this patient with this papular hemorrhagic dermatosis in a confirmed COVID-19 patient. Is absolutely similar to the kids I showed you with no systemic symptoms, the Italian papulonecrotic hemorrhagic dermatitis, and the patient was PCR swab negative and positivity with immunohistology and immunohistochemistry. This is another case of Spanish COVID-19 confirmed patient with this papulohemorrhagic disease. This is an Italian patient with PCR swab refused. The patient did not want to do the PCR swab, but histopathology and immunohistochemistry was positive for COVID-19 infection, and he had no systemic symptoms. This is a Spanish confirmed erythema multiforme in a COVID-19 patient. This is our patient, no systemic symptoms, PCR swab refused by the patient, histopathology and PCR on paraffin was positive for COVID-19 gene sequences. This is a Spanish confirmed patient and our patient, no systemic symptoms, PCR swab not done, but histopathology was absolutely that of livedoid pattern with microthrombi diffusing the dermis. This is a Spanish confirmed COVID-19 patient with a chickenpox appearance, and this is our patient, PCR swab not done, but histopathology and immunohistochemistry was positive, and he had no systemic symptoms. Is the case that I showed you with the histopathology of a Grover disease. A Spanish patient, COVID-19 confirmed, an Italian PCR swab negative patient, histopathology and immunohistochemistry was positive in the specimen, and the lesions are absolutely similar. Papule, hemorrhagic, and papule and small nodule, looks like lymphomatoid papulosis, no systemic symptoms. This woman has a urticaria eruption in Spanish. She was COVID-19, and this patient comes from Italy. I just showed you. PCR swab was refused. Immunohistochemistry and histopathology was positive, and she has no systemic symptoms, no fever, no cough, only giant urticaria. This is funny for the location. Spanish teenager with COVID-19, and this is an Italian teenager, PCR swab negative, histopathology and immunohistochemistry was positive, and she has no systemic symptoms except obviously from the skin. This is a Spanish confirmed urticaria eruption in a small boy, and this is our patient, PCR swab negative, histopathology immunohistochemistry positivity, and later IgG on serum positivity, and no systemic symptoms. And final, Spanish confirmed patient with large urticarial eruption on the hand, and this is our patient with PCR swab. He refused PCR swab, but histopathology, PCR on paraffin section and immunohistochemistry was positive. The weak point of SARS-CoV-2 is the skin. The virus cannot hide in the skin. How many information could it give out to us? Where will be in 3 months? Watch out, and always remember, clinical feature and hematoxylin eluting shows it all. If your eyes and your brain are working properly. So, I say you a big hello, a huge hello from Milan, Italy. See you next time. Bye!